Hey guys, welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about the road to war or the road to revolution and really focus on the start or moving towards war and what was going on. We're also going to be talking about today something called the shot heard around the world. You may have heard it before. There is a great song down in the resource section of this pod that will give you a little insight into just what that means. So our objectives for today, to describe the origins of the Revolutionary War, and then to explain and assess the events that occurred leading up to the first shots of war. Our essential questions, remember you don't have to answer these or submit them, but you should be thinking about them as we're going through. What were the events of the American Revolution? And why and how did the revolution begin? And some of these questions we've looked at before and partially answered, so today we will be answering them in full. So last time we left off, we were talking about the causes of the revolution, one major one being no taxation without representation. So remember, the colonists did not have a voice in Parliament in England, so they were technically being taxed without having the ability to say, yes, we agree, or no, we don't agree. Now remember, every other place in England, every other province, does have a say in Parliament. The colonists are the only ones that don't. So in other words, they had no role in their government. They had no voice. They had no part in it. And this will be, we will see that having a voice in government will be a major foundation of the new government of the United States once it is formed. There will be a number of various protests that take place as a result of the oppressive nature of all of the different acts and all of the different taxes that are going through. A few, we talked about some of these, some we did not. First, Patrick Henry, that's a name that you will need to know. He gave a speech to the Virginia Assembly. Basically, he was trying to get them to agree to independence, to help in this war, to send troops to help fight this war against the British. And he's famous for making the quote, "Give me liberty or give me death." And that's just trying to show how much it's needed, that he would rather be dead than live in a country without liberty, which is exactly what was going on at this time for the colonists. At this time, we also had the Sons and Daughters of Liberty. These were groups that would organize any type of resistance against the British. Sometimes they would use violence as scare tactics, try to scare tax collectors. They would actually throw tar onto them and then feather them. And this was very cruel because the tar would actually burn their skin and sometimes even result in death. The Sons of Liberty were the ones responsible for the Boston Tea Party, so you'll remember that. And one Son of Liberty, John Adams, will be famous for naming the Boston Massacre as it was. And those were some items that we talked about in the last lesson. Now, one thing you might not have known, the Boston Tea Party was not the only tea party to take place here in the U.S. They also took place in Charleston, New York, Annapolis, and a number of others. There was even an all-women tea party in Edenton where women started throwing the tea out as well. So during this time period, as these acts are being passed, we're going to see a new king come to the throne in England, and his name will be King George III. Now, as a result of the Boston Tea Party, he's going to be really upset because he's going to be losing that money that the colonists cost them by throwing the tea overboard. So now they can't sell it. So what we're going to see is King George III is going to react. He is actually going to try to punish the colonists for the Boston Tea Party by imposing the Intolerable Acts. The Intolerable Acts, also known as the Coercive Acts, What happened here? The Royal Navy of England blockaded the Boston harbor, so no goods could be sent out, no goods could come in until the tea was paid for. So in reality, this really was punishment for the Tea Party. Um, Colonists also under these acts had to quarter the British soldiers, meaning they had to allow them to live in their homes. Now, it didn't specifically say live in their homes, but it said they did have to provide for clothes and food and whatever else they needed. And then the last thing under the Intolerable Acts was that King George III decided that Massachusetts would no longer govern itself, and instead he would send over a military ruler, a general, to make sure taxes were being collected, to make sure there were no other protests, and to keep everything in order. So in other words, Boston was almost under siege. England was taking full control of them, and they thought by doing this that they would crush the rebellion. They would crush anybody who was speaking of independence. But in reality, what it actually did was it made the colonies unite together even more. So what we're going to see as a result of the Intolerable Acts, the colonies are going to unite together to aid the people of Massachusetts who are under military rule and who are now arming themselves to prepare for battle. And this is when we're going to see the First Continental Congress meet. And when they meet, they're going to decide what is it that we're going to do about these acts? Is there any way that we can avoid war? What can we do to fix these problems that we, the colonists, have started? So the first time the First Continental Congress will meet will be 1774. Now, when you think about the First Continental Congress, just think of it as this was the very first, very small example of government that we had for the colonists, a united government, so to speak. So there were 55 delegates that went there from over 12 colonies. The only colony that was not present was Georgia. Now, their main goal here, they listed all of the problems that they had with King George III, listed all of the problems they had with the Stamp Act, the Sugar Act, the Intolerable Acts, so on and so forth. And they actually wrote up a list of these grievances and sent them to King George III to try to fix these problems, not necessarily to fight a war. Now, at the First Continental Congress, each colony had one vote represented, and already we're kind of starting to see the foundations of things that our government now, the current government of America, would come to include. So, what we're going to see happen next, the king is pretty much going to ignore that list of grievances that the colonists sent him, and instead is going to send over 20,000 British soldiers, and we're going to call them redcoats because of the red coat that they wear as their uniform. Excuse me. So, it's 1775. British General Gage is in Massachusetts, offering security, as the British will call it, but for the colonists, it will really be oppression. So, this British general is going to learn that the people of Massachusetts are starting to arm themselves. They're starting to build up their weapons. And so he finds out that in one particular town called Concord, there's a group of colonists who are actually piling up their weapons and starting a militia. And we'll look at what that word means, militia, in just a little bit. So, what General Gage is going to do, he's going to send the British soldiers to Concord to capture the militia's weapons, to take them out and to stop any type of rebellion that could occur. Now, Lexington, which is another town that is going to stock up on weapons, and Concord, these will be the first two sites for the first battles of the Revolution. And this is where we will hear the shot heard round the world. But before we get there, we have a few midnight rides to make. As General Gage is sending his men to Concord, word makes its way to Boston, letting them know that the Redcoats are on their way. And so Paul Revere and William Dawes are going to make a midnight ride the night before to warn the Minutemen, or the colonists who have armed themselves and who are ready to fight, of approaching soldiers, that they were on their way and they were coming to get their weapons and to break up their militias. So this is when Paul Revere makes his famous ride, shouting out, "The British are coming! The British are coming!" And that will lead us to our very first battle between the British and the colonists. And like we said, that would take place at Lexington and Concord on April 19, 1775. Now, to this day, we're not actually sure who yelled fire. Someone in the crowd yelled fire, and both sides started shooting. So who began the Revolutionary War? We're actually not sure to this day, but the important thing is that it was such a significant moment. It was such an important moment. We still today call it shot heard round the world, because this is going to be the first time that colonists are fighting back against their homeland, against the mother country. And it's going to be an example for other colonists around the world to break free and fight back against their oppressive rulers as well. So that's what we mean when we say the shot heard round the world, because it was so very significant. So, once the war begins, we're going to see the Second Continental Congress meet. We just call it the Second Continental Congress because it was the second meeting, meaning the second grouping of them. So notice this isn't just one day that they're meeting several times throughout the years. So, the Second Continental Congress is primarily going to be responsible for establishing the Continental Army. This will be the colonist army, or the Army of the United States, when we finally break away. They're also going to choose a general to lead the Continental Army, and that will be General George Washington. They're going to choose George Washington because of his successes during the French and Indian War. So, he was chosen by this very, very early government, and he would go on to not only lead this war, but also to become our first president. Probably the most important thing that happened at the Second Continental Congress, though, was the writing of the Declaration of Independence. So, just in case you're not sure what we mean with a declaration or independence, a declaration is simply an official statement being made, whereas independence referring to the freedom to govern on one's own without anybody else watching over you. So, what we're going to see happen, the Second Continental Congress is going to declare independence. Now, at first, this was a really hard decision for them, because if it didn't all work out, if they didn't win this war, then they would be considered traitors of England, and they would actually be executed for this crime. So what they're going to do is they're actually going to say, you know what, enough is enough. We need to at least try. And so they'll declare independence. They will decide to have Thomas Jefferson draft up a document. So Jefferson will be the author of the Declaration of Independence, although he will not be one to sign it. So we're going to see that he's declaring the colonies free and independent states, meaning being free from England, and it will be signed by this Second Continental Congress on July 4th, 1776. And that's why we celebrate Independence Day on July 4th of every year. One interesting fact, when Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, he was actually pretty young. He was only 33 years old, whereas the average age of most of the Second Continental Congress was well into their 40s and 50s. So he was on the younger side, but obviously a great writer, since this is still a document that is very much used today, not just here in America, but around the world as well. So when we decide, many people in the 13 colonies were split, meaning they didn't know whether they should continue supporting the king or should now support these rebels, because that's what they were seen as. They weren't seen as the United States yet. They were simply seen as these rebellious people who were trying to fight a war. So one thing that's going to make many colonists go to the side of the Patriots, or to join the side of the Patriots, is actually going to be a book, a pamphlet called Common Sense. Now, this pamphlet was written by a very famous man, Thomas Paine, and basically what it did was it encouraged colonists to declare their independence from Great Britain. And it was influential because so many people had read it. Now, some things that Thomas Paine did, he actually related the idea of independence and the idea of a democratic republic to the Bible. Now, why is that a big deal? Well, during this time period, remember, religion was a huge factor in many people's lives. And the Bible was something that you could pretty much say everyone had read. It was actually a bestseller, still is a bestseller today. And so he actually is able to reach his audience. He's able to get through to them and really influence them to join the Patriots by drawing similarities between what was going on with them and the oppression that they were undergoing. And he compared it to the Bible and what Jesus went through. So a lot of people kind of joined up with the Patriots because they said, oh, well, this is just like me fighting for, my religious rights as well. It's not just about our political freedom, but our religious freedoms as well. And so what we're going to see is many colonists will become patriots, but there will still be a portion of people here in the colonies that will remain loyal to the king, and we will call them loyalists. So once we see the division between patriots and loyalists, and we've heard the shot heard round the world, this is truly the start of the Revolutionary War. This is the start of the war for American independence. Now, we'll get more into the war for independence in our next pod. So now what I'd like you to do, go ahead, answer the questions below, and move on to our activity, and then you can move on to our next topic for this week.